Welcome to the TTS Talking Educators podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in educational settings. Hello, my name is Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Educators podcast. I am a senior lecturer at Bath Spa University, an associate lecturer at the Open University, and an independent speaker, consultant and writer through critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting oracy in primary and early year settings, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Amy Gaunt as today's guest. Welcome to the podcast, Amy. How are you today?
Thanks, Shaddai. I'm very well, thank you.
Brilliant. Just before we get started, perhaps you could introduce yourself for our listeners.
Yes, so I am Director of Learning, Impact and Influence at Voice 21. Voice 21 is the national oracy education charity. So we're working this year currently with about 1,100 schools across the UK to support them to embed high quality oracy education. I'm also a co-author of a book called Transform Teaching and Learning Through Talk, the Oracy Imperative, and a former primary school teacher, and have taught kind of in London and internationally. That's me.
Excellent. So let's get straight into it, Amy. What is oracy and why does it matter?
So oracy, it's actually quite a contested term in terms of the definition, but at Voice 21, we choose to define oracy as articulating ideas, developing understanding and engaging with others through speaking, listening and communication. And we've deliberately sort of chosen that definition of oracy, which is quite different to the definition that you might find if you type oracy into Google, which chooses, the kind of the Oxford Dictionary definition chooses to emphasise things like speaking grammatically and speaking fluently. But for us at Voice 21, oracy is about how we engage with others. It's about how we develop our thinking, our understanding through talk. So we've got a very sort of broad and inclusive definition of oracy.
Yeah, that's really interesting what you say there about not emphasising this proper one way to speak English. And I guess that perhaps is something that listeners might think when you think about oracy, but you're saying it's a much more open and inclusive way of understanding that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting when you think about oracy as compared to writing. I think when you're thinking about spoken language and communication, everyone has a lot of kind of ideas about kind of what really effective kind of communication is, and they bring that to bear on the concept of oracy. And part of our work at Voice 21 is really broadening people's understanding of what we mean by oracy. And it doesn't mean kind of speaking in one sort of correct way. It's about being able to have a really sort of broad repertoire of speaking, listening and communication skills, being able to kind of very deliberately sort of think about the way that we might choose to speak in different contexts. It's really about equipping students with that sort of agency to use their voices in different contexts.
Absolutely. I want to understand why, in your understanding, oracy is so important. Are we not talking enough? What's the issue happening at the moment?
Why is oracy so important? I think talk is hugely important, isn't it? It's really important for learning. We know that there's a huge body of academic evidence which shows that sort of talk-rich approaches to teaching, so dialogic teaching, is really effective. It supports academic attainment. I know personally from having sort of taught in that way in the classroom, but also working with Voice 21 oracy schools across the country, that it's a great way to bring sort of joy into learning, to help students kind of engage with the content of what they're learning, to bring themselves into the classroom and to really sort of grapple with kind of big ideas and concepts through talk and really sort of get to grips with those. So we know that a focus on oracy in the classroom is really effective for learning, but I guess for life beyond school, oracy is really, really important too. So it's really important in our relationships with other people. To be a good friend, to be a good partner, we need to be able to kind of express ourselves, to listen to people, to talk to others and to connect in that way. So it's really important that we're developing those skills in our young people. And then I guess for the world of work and employment as well, I think as we're moving towards a future where there's more sort of, generative AI that can do lots of writing tasks, it's those, sort of human skills like oracy that become, that have more sort of currency in the workplace. So it's really important that we're equipping children with those skills.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm really hearing the benefits of oracy-focused school for children's personal well-being as well as their attainment. So it really does feel like there's a need to emphasise oracy in the classroom. I'm just wondering about what your sense is of how well teachers are understanding oracy at the moment in classrooms. How effective are they doing it? Do you feel that there's more work to be done?
I think so at Voice 21 we've been around for 10 years this year actually, and when we first started, oracy was one of those terms that lots of people hadn't heard of. Sort of people would look at you sort of slightly blankly when you talked about oracy, and that's definitely changing. We're working with so many schools across the country, about 1 in 20 schools, to embed oracy. So I don't think it's something that teachers aren't thinking about. There's some really, really effective practice in the classroom that's happening. I think as soon as sort of teachers have sort of professional development in oracy and start sort of thinking about it and it's almost like a bit of a light bulb moment, and they're like, oh yeah, actually I need to think quite deliberately and quite explicitly about this. And as soon as that happens, I think kind of practice around oracy really starts to change and improve, and it's something that we find that teachers get quite passionate about. I think what needs to change is the value that it has in policy. So we've seen that, oracy is in the national curriculum, but the pages on spoken language, I think they sit within the English programme of study. There's probably, I think there's 2 pages on spoken language, and there's about 20 or 30 pages when it comes to reading and writing. So I think we need to kind of emphasise the value and the importance of oracy through that guidance and that support that we provide through a sort of policy lens to schools, to emphasise that value so that teachers have permission to focus on oracy.
Yeah, that focus on oracy feels really important. I'm just wondering if we were to walk into a school tomorrow that really focused on oracy and had an oracy-rich curriculum perhaps, and we'll cover more specific aspects of that later on, what would we see in here and what would that look like? Yeah,
so when we think about oracy at Voice 21, we think about it as learning to and learning through talk. So learning to talk is making sure that we're sort of deliberately and explicitly teaching oracy skills. So we're building students' sort of repertoire of speaking, listening and communication skills. And that's very, as I said, deliberate and explicit. And that we're also providing opportunities for students to develop their thinking, their knowledge, their understanding through talk, but making sure that we're teaching them the oracy skills they need to be able to do that effectively. So I think if you walked into a school where they'd really thought quite a lot about their oracy practice, you'd see both halves of that Venn diagram, where students would be learning to talk and also learning through talk. And I guess to provide a little bit more on the learning to talk side of that Venn diagram, which are those sort of oracy skills that we want to sort of deliberately teach our students. At Voice 21, we think about those as the 4 strands of the oracy framework. So the oracy framework was a tool that we developed in partnership with the University of Cambridge as part of an EEF funded project a long time ago now, about 7 or 8 years ago now, I think. And essentially that splits oracy into 4 sort of distinct but interleaving strands. So you've got the physical strand, which is about the physicality around your voice, so how you use your voice as an instrument, so tone, pitch, pace, volume, those sorts of things, but also your gestures, your actions, your body language, those sorts of things. Then you've got the cognitive strand, which is about the sort of content, the structure behind your talk, the thinking, the reasoning that you use through your talk. Linguistic strand, which is about the words and the phrases that we use and how we bring those together through speech. And then finally the social emotional strand, which in a sort of a discussion like this might be how you engage with the listener in a more sort of presentational context. It might be, your confidence when speaking to an audience. If you're speaking in a group, it might be those group dynamics, how you make sure that everybody gets a chance to speak. So you'd expect students to be developing those 4 strands of the oracy framework through those opportunities to learn to talk, but they'd also have loads of opportunities to develop and put those into practice through the other half of that Venn diagram, learning through talk.
To talk and through talk, that feels like a really useful framework that teachers can easily reflect upon to consider how effective oracy is embedded into their classroom environments. I think the non-verbal aspect of this is quite interesting though, and the gestures and the things we don't say that feed into everyday oracy for me feels really important as well. Perhaps you could speak a little bit more about that.
In what way?
In terms of, I'm wondering how we can support teachers to go beyond just talking more and support students to recognise the non-verbal of communication and how those gestures and features, postures, how does that contribute towards language, and how can we support teachers to embed that in their schools?
Yeah, so I think with all of the strands of the framework, it's really important that you're thinking about the context for talk that students are speaking in. So, for example, if you're doing storytelling with students, it's really worth sort of taking that context for talk and then thinking about those 4 strands and really breaking down, what would really effective oracy look like within that context. So what's the sort of language that we might be expecting students to use in the linguistic strand? We might be using storytelling language. When it comes to the cognitive strand, so the structure, we'd be thinking about the structure of the story, how they're telling that. In the physical strand, obviously in that context, you'll be thinking about how you're really going to engage your reader. You'd be thinking about how you might change your voice depending on the different parts of the story, the mood of the story that you're telling, how your gestures and your actions might emphasize different points of a story. So I think it's really dependent on the context for talk that's happening, and really supporting teachers to think really carefully about what are the kind of individual skills within that framework that they want to explicitly teach their students, and then thinking about, what are my students already really good at? It might be that you've got some amazing, really expressive students. They're great at using gestures and actions. Great, we don't need to teach that. I'm really going to focus on how they're connecting with their audience, or the structure of their talk as part of that story, for example. So I think it's about knowing your students and then also being able to sort of unpick those skills underneath those 4 strands. And that's where it's really useful, I think, because as a teacher, understanding the oracy framework really helps you to kind of conceptualise what we mean by those oracy skills and which oracy skills you might need to explicitly teach.
Yeah, I think what you say about knowing your students, for me, feels really important. I come from an early years background where it's much less children typically, and we have a much closer relationship. But I understand that in schooling contexts with larger classrooms, that can be a bit more difficult to really understand the specificities of what's going on in that child's life. So perhaps you could speak to some strategies that teachers might use to better know their children, understand their oracy histories, so to speak.
Yeah, so it's quite a tricky one because, beyond the early years, we don't actually, formally assess students' oracy skills. So early years teachers are really proficient in this because obviously so much of what teachers in the early years are doing relies on communication and language. It really sits there in those early learning goals. So it's something that they're really, really expert at. And I think we tend to lose that a little bit as we move sort of beyond the early years, and we'll tend to look at students reading and students writing, but often we don't sort of unpick what are the sort of the language and the communication needs that might sit underneath those. So there are various frameworks, particularly if you're thinking about speech and language, that you can use. So Speech and Language UK are a brilliant organisation. They've got loads of free frameworks and guidance that teachers can use to sort of unpick some of the language and communication challenges that their students might be facing. But I think when it comes sort of more broadly thinking about the oracy skills of students, it's just like you would do with any student, any sort of subject. It's just about kind of noticing how students engage in different contexts. You might think, okay, I've got this student who's really, really confident when they're in a PE lesson, for example, talking about tactics, but actually when I'm asking them to, stand up and present something to their classmates, they're much less confident. That's more of a challenge for them. So that's something that I might need to work on with them, and I might need to sort of deliberately teach them some skills to do that. I might need to think about how I build up the different audiences that students are talking to, from a smaller audience of 2 or 3, move upwards towards the class. So I think it's just about how you sort of deliberately tune into those oracy skills, and then how you sort of react to those as a teacher. And I think as teachers sort of build up their knowledge and expertise around oracy, that becomes something that they tend to notice much more.
Yeah, that proactive attunement feels like a really useful strategy for teachers, and we'll certainly speak more about that in future episodes. But for now, that feels like a really good place to end this first episode, having discussed the importance of oracy, looking at the way in which we can support it through those different strands, and really knowing the children that you're working with. So thank you very much, Amy. It's been a pleasure.
Great, thank you.
I would like to say a huge thank you to our guest Amy for joining us and providing us with such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Educators podcast with me, Dr. Shaddai Tembo, and Amy Gaunt. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and to access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your settings and links to relevant resources.